So a bit of a different look at supply chains. I'm going to be talking about them with respect to the third parties and suppliers that organizations rely upon. And specifically, what I promise to you today is I'm going to walk through how I, as a third-party risk management guy, would hack critical national infrastructure, the particular steps that I would take. I'm going to then correlate that with results that we've been seeing in the wild as we analyze the third parties of national healthcare providers, industrial companies, financial services firm. And then I'm going to talk about the ways that we try and mitigate the risks that arise from the third parties of these institutions. So, how would I personally hack a piece of critical national infrastructure? Well, I do three things, basically. And these all rely upon the current capabilities in the models. The first thing I do is realize that a lot of these large national infrastructure projects actually have a public list of the suppliers that they use and what they use them for. The first thing I would do is work out who provides what services to this public organization. Second thing I would do is run traditional security testing at volume against each one of these suppliers. Look for what exploitable vulnerabilities exist today. Then I would use some of the automated pen testing results that we've been seeing with the models to ask Claude, can you go off and exploit those vulnerabilities for me, please? So let's start with scraping their public tender list. You can use the capabilities of models like deep research to go out and find the tender list for these public organizations. Then you can use the fact that the models understand contracts, they understand context, they understand the websites of these suppliers, to go and score each of the documents to determine the importance of each one of these entities. Right? And then you can use that to identify targets. And importantly, this was not possible before due to the volume of suppliers to these national organizations. There might be thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these suppliers, and you couldn't have a team of humans look through each. But you can have a team of AIs. Second thing I would do is run traditional web security scanning and asset discovery against these suppliers. Work out at a high level what exploitable vulnerabilities exist for these suppliers. So I'd start with shallow scanning, looking for things like TLS misconfiguration, open ports on databases, the standard stuff. Then I would take the most promising candidates, hook up a pen testing tool like Nucleus to Claude, and have it go much further, do active scanning, and then finally, I would correlate that with the results that we got from the public tender list. Finally, I would bring the humans in at this point in time to exploit the vulnerabilities which have been verified on those high-value targets. And, let's say you have 1,000, 10,000 of these suppliers that you've run high-volume attacks against. There will inevitably be 10 to 100 of them that you can exploit with a human. And now that you've understood the nature of the supply chain of this critical infrastructure provider, you can then go and strike. And I think this is an example of where the models are basically providing the capability to run much higher volume strategies than previously. You don't require a large time horizon from the models in order to go off and complete this kind of strategy. You simply require current capabilities and the fact that these models are actually quite general. Leads me to my point. Very often, the largest attack surface comes from a company's third parties, not from their own internal security. And what you're seeing here is a map of a supply chain that we produced recently on our platform that shows you sort of the linkages between these various institutions. And so what do we do at HelmGuard AI? We basically analyze the third parties of critical organizations from the perspective of an AI native attacker, then provide tools to those organizations to mitigate findings. And so I've completed my first promise. That's how I'd go off and attack a national piece of infrastructure. I'm now going to go over some stuff that we've been seeing in the wild while we've been doing this against various entities. So we've now analyzed 10,000 plus entities across APAC, Europe, North America, and we typically find that about 1 in 10 of these entities has some relatively obvious misconfiguration. An open database, an expired TLS certificate on a VPN, these kinds of things. And that we believe a high percentage of those could be exploitable if we went further. Now, it's obviously not legal for us to go further, but that's what we tend to find. And there's also quite a high percentage of entities that will have relatively minor problems, but which could be exploitable with high volume enabled by the models. This looks like stuff like DNS misownership, where there is a domain associated with a particular target that people are used to using, that becomes disowned, and with the model's capabilities in web development, it's very easy to exploit that particular attack vector. And so it's quite interesting to note that essentially these third parties, these sort of legacy providers, which a lot of critical infrastructure is utilizing, has quite poor security, and that security is now discoverable, including those related. And I think 3 sort of interesting things there. The first is that it's a volume game. Really, what we're exploiting here is the fact that you can run 100 versions of Claude at once, and those 100 versions are relatively cheap. We're utilizing the abundant cognitive labor that these models provide. The second thing is that it uses the generality of the models to reason across the relationship between a supplier and a national infrastructure provider. Requires an understanding not only of vulnerabilities, but the contracts between those two. And then the third thing that we rely upon is developments like deep research to go out and find those. And so that's what we've been finding in the wild. I think it's quite an interesting attack vector, and I think it's one that is going to increase rapidly in its prevalence as various actors realize that this is a way to exploit current capabilities. And so I guess the question is, what are we to do about this? And I think what is very helpful to note is that the same properties that exist with models today that make them very good at the offense also makes them very good at the defense. So the groups that are involved and in charge of monitoring and maintaining third-party relationships in organizations are set up. There are practices there, but very often what they're lacking is the resources to go off and do their jobs. So what we do at HelmGuard is automate end-to-end the process of onboarding, continuously monitoring, and evaluating these third parties so that our customers basically get access to an abstracted platform on which they can make decisions. So we basically automate the process of going through end-to-end, collecting data about these suppliers, running security scanning, assessing their criticality to the organization, assessing their risks, and coming up with recommendations to whether or not they should or should not work with the organization. And then we continually monitor that organization so that our customers know before anybody else whether they've been hacked, is there a new sign of compromise. And again, this doesn't involve significant model capabilities. It simply requires a very high volume of the current capabilities. And so you might ask, okay, you've identified the risks. How can AI then help? And you've provided a recommendation. But then when you're coming to the decision making, how can AI help in that particular case? And so here, it's very interesting that there actually are set deterministic, there's sort of a playbook that people already use if they only had the resources internally to mitigate these third-party risks. So a good example would be changing the policy in your DLP tool to look for data sent to a high-risk supplier. Another is changing your authentication scheme with that supplier. You can also add in contractual provisions, which again is not really something we typically discuss in cybersecurity, but it is interesting that very often the way that you can control these third-party relationships is using contracts and the sort of legal reasoning of these models, rather than just necessarily the cybersecurity reasoning. And so what we found is that AI is both supercharging the outside finding these vulnerabilities in the first place and understanding the complex supply chain. But then it's also very useful internally with increasing resources. And so I guess the question is, where is this all going to end up? How are we going to sort of end up in this situation? And what I think we'll end up doing is starting to build more and more tools once we understand all the suppliers of an organization, building more and more tools to generate trust in them. So I think we'll go from a model where we are getting security certificates, where we're sending out questionnaires, into a much more active paradigm where you are continuously assessing that provider from the outside. You maybe have a right to pen test every month, and you're using the abundant cognitive labor of the models to continuously assess those vendors which you trust in your supply chain. So hopefully I've sort of satisfied the three promises, namely one, how would I go off and hack a piece of critical national infrastructure? I personally would do it through their vendors. Number two, what we're seeing out in the wild, namely that about 1 in 10 of those entities have a very clear misconfiguration in the analysis that we've done. And three, I think there's a bit of optimism, because I think you can use AI on the inside to mitigate the issues as well. And over time, I think there are going to be new technologies that enable better trust building, namely automated. Allow two entities to trust. And so I thought I'd end on like a little note, namely that the most recent OpenAI breach was actually their third party. And so that's how they got very emails. And so I think, it's a very topical issue. And often when you hear about a breach, it's actually not the first party. It's actually one of their third. We're also hiring, so anybody that wants to work at Helm Guard and analyze the supply chains of national healthcare providers, let me know. And we're looking for engineers. So hopefully that was helpful. Thanks so much.